One Amish grandmother in central Ohio keeps enough food to feed 12 people for 4 months, and not a single item on her shelves cost her more than $3. That detail has a way of stopping people cold when they first hear it. Because the instinct most folks have when they think about stocking up for an emergency is that it has to be expensive, complicated, or both. But this woman, she's been doing it quietly for decades, and the method she uses isn't really about money at all. It's about the way she thinks. So let me walk you through exactly how she does it. Because once you see the system, you'll never look at a pantry shelf the same way again. The first thing worth knowing is that she didn't invent this. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, and if you trace it back far enough, you get to communities of Swiss German settlers in the early 1800s who lived months away from the nearest general store and simply had no other option. When help is that far away, storing food isn't a hobby or a prepper project. It's just how you survive winter. And that mindset, that quiet practical assumption that the world can turn hard without warning and you'd better be ready when it does, that mindset never left the Amish community. It got passed down alongside the recipes. Now here's what most people miss when they look at an Amish pantry for the first time. They see rows of jars and bags and think, variety. But the actual genius isn't in how many different things are on those shelves. It's in how ruthlessly she has narrowed down to the things that do the most work. An Amish emergency pantry, done right, is built around what you might call anchor items. These are foods with 3 specific qualities. They last a very long time without refrigeration, they stretch across dozens of different meals, and they cost almost nothing per unit when you buy or prepare them right. The anchor items in her pantry are not exotic. We're talking dried beans, white rice, rolled oats, cornmeal, white sugar, salt, white vinegar, baking soda, and dried pasta. Every single one of those, purchased or put up at the right time and in the right way, lands under $3 for a usable quantity. And here's the thing about that list. A person who has those 9 items has the raw material for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and basic first aid for a very long time. So why does that combination work so well? Because those items don't just store well in isolation, they store well together in a system. Let's start with dried beans, because they might be the single most underestimated item in any emergency food plan. A pound of dried beans costs between 80 cents and $1.50 depending on where you live. That pound of beans cooked up yields roughly 6 cups of cooked beans. 6 cups of beans can anchor 3 or 4 substantial meals for a family. And dried beans, stored properly in a sealed container away from light and moisture, stay safe to eat for anywhere from 10 to 30 years. Though their cooking time lengthens after about 5 or 6 years, the Amish don't treat bean storage as a backup plan. They treat it as a foundation. And they rotate, which is the part that makes the whole thing work without waste. Rotation means the oldest jar comes off the back of the shelf and gets used in next week's soup, and a fresh one goes to the back of the line. This isn't a one-time buy and forget system. It's a slow, steady, almost invisible cycle that keeps the pantry full and the food fresh without ever requiring a big spend all at once. Now the same logic applies to white rice. A 2-pound bag of plain white rice runs around $1 in most areas. Stored in a sealed mylar bag or even a clean glass jar with an oxygen absorber, that rice stays good for 20 to 30 years. Brown rice, by the way, does not store like that, because the natural oils in the bran go rancid within about 6 months. So the Amish use white rice for long-term storage and get their variety from other places. This is one of those details that separates a pantry that works from one that quietly fails. Rolled oats deserve their own moment here because they are doing double duty in this system. A 42-ounce canister of rolled oats. The plain kind costs roughly $3 or a little under. That canister makes about 30 servings of oatmeal. But oats aren't just breakfast, and this is where the Amish way of thinking really shows itself. Oats go into bread when flour is running low. They thicken soups. They form the base of simple cookies or flatbreads when you need something different and you're working from a stripped-down pantry. The Amish grandmother isn't asking, "What do I eat for breakfast?" She's asking, "What can this one ingredient do across every meal today?" That shift in thinking is worth pausing on because it changes how you see every item in that pantry. Salt, for instance. A pound of plain table salt costs about 60 cents. But salt isn't just seasoning in this system. It preserves vegetables through lactofermentation. It cures meat. It extends the life of butter. It draws moisture out of produce to prevent mold. A pound of salt, used correctly, can keep other foods alive for months. The same goes for white vinegar. A gallon of plain white vinegar runs around $2.50. That gallon pickles vegetables, preserves eggs, acts as a surface disinfectant, works as a weed killer in the garden, and strips mineral buildup off of cookware. It is one of the most versatile items in the whole pantry, and it costs almost nothing. And baking soda at about $1 a box does something similar. It leavens bread when you have no yeast, it settles stomach discomfort, it functions as a mild cleaning agent, and combined with vinegar, it can unclog a drain. These aren't coincidences. The Amish, by necessity and by tradition, gravitated toward items that serve more than one purpose because storage space is limited and money is limited and you need every shelf slot to pull its weight. Now here is something most people don't think about when they're putting a stockpile together. It's not enough for the food to be cheap and long-lasting. It also has to be food you know how to cook, food your family will actually eat when things get hard. A pantry full of lentils you've never prepared is not a safety net. It's a pile of frustration waiting to happen. The Amish solve this by never separating their emergency pantry from their everyday pantry. The food she keeps in her cellar for a disaster is the same food she cooked for her family on Tuesday. This matters enormously, because if a storm knocks out power for 2 weeks, or a hard winter makes the roads impassable, she doesn't have to figure out how to use unfamiliar ingredients under stress. She already knows. Her hands already know. The recipes are already part of the week. Let me give you a concrete picture of what that looks like in practice. In a bad week, a family in her community might live on bean soup with cornbread for dinner, oatmeal with sugar and dried fruit for breakfast, and simple rice cooked with salt, and a little stored lard or oil for midday. None of that sounds glamorous, and it isn't. But it is nourishing, filling, and entirely possible from what's on those shelves. The caloric math actually holds up surprisingly well. Dried beans run about 500 kilocalories per pound. White rice runs about 600 kilocalories per pound. Rolled oats run roughly 100 kilocalories per pound. And all three cost under $3 a pound. On a pure energy basis, it is very hard to beat those numbers with almost anything else you could put on a shelf. Now let's talk about how she actually stacks this supply, because the physical method matters just as much as what's in it. The cellar is cool and dark, and that's not accidental. Light and heat are the two forces that degrade stored food the fastest even when it's sealed. An Amish cellar keeps temperatures in that 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit range through most of the year by being built into the earth. And that stable, cool environment lets the food last at the upper end of its potential shelf life rather than the lower end. But most of what she stores doesn't actually require a cellar. Glass mason jars with tight lids do the job for most dry goods. She seals beans, rice, salt, sugar, and cornmeal in jars, labels them with a grease pencil, and puts the newest jar at the back and the oldest at the front. No complicated system, no expensive gear, just consistent, patient, repeating that same small habit every time she puts up a new batch. The jars themselves are part of the economics here. A dozen wide-mouth quart mason jars runs about $10 to $12, but she has been using the same jars for 30 years, so the per-use cost is essentially nothing. The Amish approach to containers is the same as the approach to everything else. Buy it once, buy it right, and use it until it falls apart. Now there's one more piece of this that I think is the most interesting part, and it's the piece that gets left out of almost every conversation about emergency food storage. The Amish don't stockpile alone. Her neighbor knows what she keeps. She knows what her neighbor keeps. If her household runs low on cornmeal, she doesn't panic because she knows that 2 farms over there are 50 pounds of it. And that neighbor knows she can count on a jar of pickled vegetables or a wheel of cheese in return. This informal, unspoken inventory of the whole community's supplies means that any single family's pantry doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be part of a web. And this is, honestly, where the $3 per item framing really clicks. Because if you are trying to store everything you might ever need, all by yourself, against every possible disaster, the cost and the complexity become genuinely overwhelming. But if you are building your pantry as your contribution to a network where you cover some things and others around you cover different things, then $100 of basic staples actually goes a long way. So why does this particular approach work so well, even a century and a half after those first Swiss German settlers worked it out? Because it is built on the same principles the world has always used to outlast hard times. Store what is cheap, store what is useful, store what you already know how to cook, and don't try to do it entirely alone. One Amish grandmother in central Ohio keeps enough food to feed 12 people for 4 months, and not a single item on her shelves cost her more than $3. Now you know exactly why that's possible, and more importantly, you know exactly how it works. If this kind of practical, grounded knowledge is something you want more of, staying around this channel is the place to do it. Because this is what we're here for.